Okay, members, I'd like to try to get through one more item before we take a break, if that's okay with everybody. Vice Chancellor Troy, our budget update.
Good afternoon, and I assure you there will be, I hope to be in this position long enough to have a good budget update for you.
Yeah.
At some point, I recognize every time I speak with you, the system loses hundreds of millions of dollars, so I'll try to keep it brief to that regard. And when we last met in January, I did give you an overview of the governor's proposal for the system for 2012-13. Given that the legislature's not yet begun their overview of that budget, there's not a whole lot to update on the 12-13 proposal. But since that time, as we calculated the P1 apportionment for the system for the 11-12 year, what came to light was a very, very significant problem. We are showing a current year deficit, again, this is for this fiscal year, the 11-12 fiscal year, a current year deficit of $179 million. And from a statewide perspective, that is about a 3.3% shortfall at a time in the year where it's very, very difficult for districts to do anything to actually realize savings to get through the year. So this is a very, very major problem for our colleges. I've outlined for you at the top of the update I have for your how those dollars are broken down. The major issue is the first bullet point. The fee revenue collections are about $107 million short of what was anticipated when the budget was adopted last June. You might recall when the fees went up from $26 to $36 at the beginning of this fiscal year, it was estimated that we would have an increase of about $110 million in fee revenues due to that increase. As you can see, those dollars have not materialized, and that seems to be largely because more and more students are eligible for the BOG fee waiver program. And we think that's for a couple of reasons. Just the simple increase in the fees has tipped more students over that eligibility list for it, but also we think it simply reflects a change in composition of our students. The economy is bad. We have a lot of workers who are getting laid off or underemployed, and they're coming back to the community colleges to get their skills retooled for a modern economy, and they're going to be eligible for that BOG fee waiver. So this is a major, major problem for our colleges. Another component of that, just to be complete, is about $41 million in property taxes, so they're lower than was assumed at the budget. We do have the $30 million reduction due to the Tier 1 mid-year trigger, which was anticipated. So that is not going to be, since that was anticipated, that was not going to be a major push for our advocacy this year, as I'll explain in a moment. And there's about $1 million also due to miscellaneous adjustments. So effectively, we are going to be petitioning the administration and the legislature to backfill that $149 million deficit we're showing net of the Tier 1 trigger. As I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of options for districts at this time of year to make up for that problem. You can't reduce course sections. You've got your staffing is in place. There's very little you can do to get through the fiscal year other than to borrow funds or to dig even deeper into reserves than they already have been doing over recent years. And given the very major cuts we've received for the last 3 or 4 years, those reserves are indeed dwindling. So that will be a big piece of our budget advocacy. Many of us are going out tomorrow to visit members, and we'll be communicating that point to them very directly. Another issue that we think this highlights is the fact that unlike K-12, we do not have an automatic backfill in statute for shortages such as property taxes or fee revenues. If K-12 property taxes are short, the general fund automatically increases that amount they get, so they're kept whole to the level expected of them at the time the budget is passed. We don't have that protection. So you can imagine for a district, even if the legislature were to come in June or July with some additional money, that's often too late for the districts to know that it will be forthcoming. So they have to make the cuts or borrow the money regardless. If we had that statutory protection, at least districts would have some assurance that when there is the shortfall identified at P1, that they could rely on the funds being there. So we think it's a matter of equity to put that before the legislature again, and that will also be a big push in our advocacy efforts both tomorrow and going forward. The Senate Budget Subcommittee will hold their hearing on the community college budgets on March 29th. The Assembly will have their hearing on April 25th. So to the extent we can have public comment on those days, echoing the support of our position, that would be very useful, or have letters put into the committee members, that would be very helpful. The other dark cloud I will leave with you today is that last week the LAO came out with an updated economic review, and they're estimating that over the remainder of the 11-12 year and the 12-13 year, they're projecting revenues about $6.5 billion below the level that the governor has estimated. And the key point of difference between the two entities seems to be, has to do with the volatility of those upper income earners. Our state's revenue structure is highly dependent on capital gains, returns from those upper income earners. It's a very volatile revenue source, and the LAO and Department of Finance have very major differences into how much revenue that group will be kicking into the state coffers over the next 18 months. So that's a key issue to keep an eye out for. That would, if the LAO is right, the legislature will have to find either more cuts or more revenues to backfill the hole. So we may not be out of the woods yet. And with that, with that somber note, I'll take any questions or comments you have.
Member Hawkins.
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon, Dan. In reviewing the three big proposals that are revenue enhancements, the governor's in particular, one of the areas that I found interesting was where it talked about tying second-year funding to the system tied to student success outcomes. Is there any more definition or any clarity that you know of about that? And isn't that what performance-based funding is? And didn't we address that with the Student Success Task Force recommendation?
Yeah, just to provide a little context, in the governor's budget, and looking ahead to the 13-14 fiscal year, he did propose that the three higher education segments would receive annual increases of at least 4% a year, again, beginning in 13-14, and for a few years after that. But that part of that agreement would be that we'd be held accountable for certain results. So I think we can imagine that some of those results would be things like degree completion, transfer, et cetera. But we've not been given any, that has not been described in any great detail at this point, what that plan looks like.
So the language is general in nature, and would you foresee further definition as the deliberations go forward?
I'd expect perhaps at May revision that would be a time when the governor would want to unveil what those performance measures were. Talk about that in a little more detail.
Chancellor Scott.
One of the things you need to keep in mind is that these are the governor's proposals. These are not something that the legislature necessarily goes along with. For instance, the governor has proposed in the next year's budget, if I read it correctly, that all categorical programs would be flexible. By that, they could be spent, the total amount could be spent on categorical proposals as the districts see fit. It's unlikely, in my judgment, that the legislature, who feels rather strongly about some of those categorical programs, would go along with the governor's proposal. And that's the same way we're talking about performance-based funding. As you know, the Student Success Task Force chose to say that we do not believe that performance-based funding is appropriate. And I will, however, tell you that a legislator, once again this year, introduced the idea of performance-based funding, a rather harsh proposal that simply says that our funding will be based upon two census dates, the 5th week and student completion. Once again, I'm not, we will oppose that, but on the other hand, because that's certainly a rather draconian proposal, it doesn't take into account a whole lot of things in terms of student completion. Once again, I'm not, I do not feel that will be passed by the legislature. However, if you'll recall that several of us have said that unless we take some steps forward in terms of student success, that we do leave the door open for more drastic proposals, which we would not be pleased with at all. And that has happened in this case. So I will tell you that performance-based funding is something that has happened in quite a number of states, and in quite a number of states it is not proposed. So, and I do know, aside from our own United, once we were 2 years ago when we were confronted with a performance-based funding proposal, all factions of the community college joined hands and opposed it. And so since Member Hawkins has raised this question, I thought I might update you a little bit upon what is happening in that regard. I do know, frankly, that there are some very important educational leaders in the legislature that oppose performance-based funding. And but I thought maybe our good friend Vice Chancellor Garcia was going to point a few of these things out, but I thought I would let you know since Member Hawkins brought the issue up.
Member McDougall.
Dan, I think one of the significant problems that exists for a board such as ours is having accurate information on which to base a set of policy directives. It seems as though the system for at least the past 3 to 5 years has been fraught with bad predictions that have not materialized, different aspects of government saying one thing versus another. And it's fine because it gives you a sense of hope, but then it comes crashing down, oftentimes during the most inopportune periods to do something about it, such as trying to deal with a $179 million cut when you're about 60% through the year and have almost no capability of cutting back without destroying programs and other things within the colleges. And I'm just wondering that perhaps as a board, if we should, and I say this to Chancellor as well, try to honestly come up with what we feel the most accurate prediction is going to be, whether that's between the legislative analysts and the governor's office, and perhaps urging policies or even coming close to mandating policies that ensures the money that is available is utilized in a way that gives a maximum return to the state. For example, I'll state this, and it may not be that popular, but the Chancellor mentioned this morning about West Hills Community College and the wonderful program, from my perspective, that they have with their high schools and what that has meant in terms of enrollment, plus 35% from one year to the next. They have clearly made a decision on that local level to put an emphasis on access by high school students. And I applaud that, but that's an individual decision. It's not something that is necessarily has the imprimatur of the Chancellor's office or the state. We have talked about career technical education, transfer, and again, basic skills as being our priorities. If we knew with some degree of certainty within a 60 to 90% range of probability that the budget was going to be X, this board might want to consider some action that would, if not strongly urge, come close to mandating the expenditures in those three program areas. So I guess what I'm saying to you, because you're in the chair of being the head financial person, that it seems to me that any organization that has a responsibility to try to develop a financial plan for the effectiveness of the constituency that it represents, that at some point we have to decide on what is good information. And we then have to try to make policies of how the mission for which we're responsible is achieved to the greatest degree. And I don't think we've done that because we've not had good information. And it doesn't appear as though we're going to have good information unless we make a decision on what our information is going to be. So I hope my point is clear. I think it is, but I would at least urge that we give more consideration to that point.
Dan, I'll let you respond, and I certainly sympathize with the notion, Member McDougall, but certainly based on my experience up here, I can't think of a plausible way, quite frankly, to do that. I mean, it's really evident that usually the Department of Finance and the legislature are wrong in their projections, and I don't know. I don't think they purposely set out to do that. But I don't know how we control some of the factors that cause those projections to be wrong. Having said that, Dan, why don't you respond?
Well, my assumption, just to clarify,
Yeah.
my assumption is that the legislative analyst has had a fairly good track record over time on predicting what revenue is going to be, at least a much better track record than has come from the executive offices.
I have to defer to either
don't know.
Dan or Eric on that. I don't know that that's the case, quite frankly.
Yeah, well, I would say, I think it would be somewhat problematic for us to try to be in the position of saying that we think LAO's numbers, for example, are more reliable than the Department of Finance, as we don't have our own system of economic forecasting and revenue projections here. We don't really necessarily have the basis upon which to make that judgment. I think one thing that I've tried to do in my time here, and I know Eric Skinner did before me, was to the best we can, highlight the risks that are out there to the districts, to know that if we have trigger cuts out there, to know that if there are major disagreements about the revenue projections between LAO and the Department of Finance, to try to highlight that to the districts so that can inform their planning to the extent possible. I think that's a role we can certainly take on, and that's one that I take very seriously in my position here. I think one thing the board could potentially do, as we've seen, and this is a clear recommendation in the Student Success Task Force, is to set priorities for expenditure. And in some cases, those may simply be guidelines, but for setting those enrollment priorities that are in the task force, for example, I think that's a very useful role for the board to take at this point in time. And there may be other priorities you wish to set as well to account for your concerns.
Okay. Any other comments from the board? Thank you very much. We're going to take a 10-minute break and return with the remainder of our agenda.